Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and we have a very interesting quartet of motherboards to look at today, catering for both Intel and AMD fans out there. So whether you're in the market for an upgrade or building an entirely new system, whether you're going for Core Ultra 200 from Intel or going for Ryzen 7000 or 9000 from AMD, we have a motherboard for you today. And the reason why I want to look at all of these four motherboards is because they are part of MSI's Tomahawk range. So the Tomahawks in the past have punched well above their weight, offered excellent value for money, and included all the latest current features as well. So they've been great value options in the past, and I want to see if they're just as good value options today, but specifically looking at the differences between the two boards that we have on both AMD and Intel camps here today, because there are a few differences and I want to check out what those differences are and which board is probably best for you. So in the AMD corner, compatible with Ryzen 7000 and 9000 series processors, we have the MAG B850 Tomahawk Max Wi-Fi. So the B850 chipset is seen as the slightly more mainstream chipset. You can save a fair bit of cash going for that chipset as well if you don't need all the massive load of bandwidth and connectivity that the X870E chipset offers. And the X870E chipset, obviously AMD's premium chipset for its Socket AM5 platform, and we have the MAG X870E Tomahawk Wi-Fi to look at as well. We'll be comparing those two boards later on in the video. In the Intel corner, we have two boards as well. We have the MAG Z890 Tomahawk Wi-Fi, and also up here we have the MAG B860 Tomahawk Wi-Fi as well. So B860 again seen as the more mainstream chipset, and from the outset I can say that the biggest difference between those two boards is that the B860 chipset does not support overclocking via the multiplier, which is the way that you generally want to do things when you're overclocking. The Z890 board does offer of overclocking by way of an unlocked multiplier. So that's probably the biggest difference there. Less of a difference over this side, because both of these motherboards can overclock AMD Ryzen 7000 or 9000 series processors. So including indeed the latest Ryzen 9000 X3D models that support overclocking for the first time. So both of these motherboards able to tweak those. So we're going to be checking out the pricing, the specifications, and coming to some conclusions at the end with these motherboards. Unboxing, see what you get inside, and coming to some conclusions at the end. So thanks to MSI for sponsoring today's video, and for sending all of these motherboards over for us to have a look at, and hopefully there'll be some real winners that we'll be looking at here today as well. And you can see the links about where to buy all of the products in today's video down in the description below. And if you really want to help out on the channel, you can also subscribe, turn on notifications, and liking and commenting on this video really helps as well. Just punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed. So that's it for the intro. Let's check out the motherboards. So what really helps when choosing a new motherboard is to check out the specifications compared to a lot of the competition. In this case, the competition are either cheaper or slightly more expensive versions of the Tomahawk. So there's a lot to unpick here, but we'll hopefully go through them fairly quickly in terms of the specifications. But first of all, let's look at the pricing comparison of the boards that we're looking at here today. So we've got the MSI B850 over here on the left, so that's $210. The pricing here is pretty good on Newegg. Amazon is fairly similar as well, and you can see links to all of these motherboards down in the description down below as well. So the MSI MAG B850 retails for about £210, and the X870E model retails for a fair bit more. So we're looking at around a $90 increase there in terms of the price. Now that is not the same as what we see on the Intel side, because there is next to nothing between the MSI MAG B860 Tomahawk and the Z890 Tomahawk. There is a sale going on Newegg right now for the Z890 model, and that means that it costs barely $10 more than the B860 model. And as we'll see in a minute, there's quite a few reasons why you might want to pick the Z890 model. Even discounting overclocking, there are some other features that you might want to consider it. So those are the pricing. All four motherboards less than $300. In fact, they'll all leave you with some sort of change from $300. The cheapest board here is the B850 Tomahawk. So if you're going for an AMD system, that's an excellent buy right now, because it supports overclocking and it's got a pretty decent set of features that we'll look at in a moment as well. So let's head back to the MSI page and we can start delving into the specifications. Okay, let's delve into the specifications then. And first and foremost, we should probably emphasize what board is compatible with what processor. And the two AMD boards are compatible with Ryzen 7000, 8000 and 9000 series CPUs. You've probably only heard of 9000 and 7000 series because they're the sort of more standard desktop processors that you would probably want to buy for gaming and that kind of stuff. This also includes the 3D Vcache models. So basically, if you get either of these boards, the X870E or the B850, it will be compatible with any Ryzen 9000 or 7000 series CPU. Now, when it comes to Intel, we only have one generation of processors that's compatible with these boards because Intel released these late last year, and they are the Core Ultra series desktop processors. So you'll be out of luck if you're hoping to transplant a 12th gen, 13th gen or 14th gen CPU from the previous generation into these motherboards, because LGA1851 is the new processor socket and it doesn't support them. So memory-wise, there's not too much difference between the boards going on here. I think Intel generally can support higher frequency memory, especially when it comes to QDIMM memory. I've had both of these boards running at 8400 megahertz QDIMM DDR5 memory with various different kits, so definitely worth considering if you want to get maximum performance out of your Intel system. AMD does support it, but you have to jump through quite a few hoops to actually get there, and I've found that generally getting above about 7000 megahertz on AMD is still a bit hit or miss, and there are limited benefits from that as well. So personally, with AMD, I would just go for a 6400 megahertz kit, and you'll probably save quite a bit of money doing that as well. And if you want to go for an AMD Expo rated kit, then that will generally make your life a bit easier too. So that is pretty much it as far as memory goes. Both motherboards and all sets of CPUs support onboard graphics, and there are some Intel CPUs that don't support onboard graphics, so they're usually the KF models where they ditch the onboard graphics to make the thing a little bit cheaper. The downside for that, I wouldn't really suggest anybody does go for one of those CPUs, even if they are a bit cheaper, because having an integrated graphics chip on the processor that's actually working does mean that you have a troubleshooting device. For example, if your graphics card dies or something like that, at least you can use your PC and just do usual stuff like watch Netflix and do work or whatever, and web browse obviously, but you just won't be able to play games very well. So yeah, there's just that option there if you wanted to do it, but all of these boards have HDMI ports for outputting the video from the CPU if you need to. Now, when it comes to slots, PCI Express slots, all motherboards here support PCI Express 5 on their primary graphics slots, so not that much use at the moment, but in future you might see a bit of extra bandwidth there. So if you're planning on keeping your PC for more than a few years, having a PCI Express 5 graphics slot is potentially useful, and it adds in a bit of future proofing. So all the motherboards do that here, and all motherboards have additional slots as well. The downside is with the cheaper boards, this often sees bandwidth sharing, and there's going to be a bit more bandwidth sharing that we're going to go into in a minute with the M.2 slots. So both of the more expensive motherboards, on the left we've got the AMD X870E, and on the third slot here we have the Intel Z890. Neither of those boards has bandwidth sharing on the PCI Express slots, so it doesn't matter what else you do, you'll always see maximum speed from those slots. Whereas the other two boards, for example here, we've got the B850 Tomahawk, the PCI Express 3 slot will run at 2 times speed if you drop in an SSD into the M.2 third slot. And over here on the right, the B860 Tomahawk will also see its PCI Express E3 slot, which is probably the third slot down, I guess, dropping to 2 times speed if you drop in a PCI Express device into the slot above it. So always worth bearing in mind those bandwidth limitations and lane sharing, because it does explain a lot of situations where people online have said, hey, my SSD is only running at half the speed that it is, and you find out that they've got a whole bunch of other stuff plugged in, and one of those ports is sharing bandwidth. So always worth checking this section. It's pretty important, especially if you are plugging in multiple PCI Express devices, whether that's graphics cards or sound cards or SSDs. Now, moving on to the audio, and all the boards are very, very similar here, except for the Tomahawk B860, and that's dipping down to ALC Z897, the Realtek codec there. So that's generally considered a bit inferior to the other codecs that we have here, which are the 4000 and 1200 series. So the Realtek 1220 is pretty much the same codec as the 4080 on the left, except it is basically having the standard implementation, whereas the ALC 4080 codec runs over the USB bus, which some don't like, but on the whole, it's usually fine. But both the AMD boards use that implementation, whereas the Z890 model has the standard implementation and is the familiar ALC 1220 codec from Realtek. Now, with storage, great big wall of red text here. So at the top, we can see that all of the motherboards here have at least one PCI Express 5 M.2 slot, and we have a few additional PCI Express 5 slots in terms of M.2 on the other slots as well. So both AMD motherboards have two PCI Express 5 compatible M.2 slots. The Intel Z890, which is here, that one only has one, and obviously the B850, B860 motherboard only has one as well. So definitely worth considering if you're opting for lots of PCI Express 5 SSDs. I don't really know why you'd want to do that, unless you just need maximum sequential speeds or something. It doesn't really make that much difference elsewhere. But yeah, I know some people out there will probably do that. And all of the boards here having 4 M.2 ports, whereas the B860 board is limited to just 3. But again, that's probably enough for most people out there. Now, when it comes to bandwidth sharing, we'll start off on the left with AMD. So if we go down here, the second M.2 slot will be unavailable if you use a Ryzen 8000 series CPU, which I'm guessing most of you reading this probably won't do. So we also have a limitation with the USB 4 ports, or the Type-C ports on the back panel. So they share PCI Express 5 bandwidth, so both will run at PCI Express 5.0 when a device is installed into the M.2 slot, and you can also switch the M.2 to PCI Express ×4 in the BIOS, but it will disable those USB 4 ports. So always worth bearing in mind the limitations that we have here, so the bandwidth, the lane sharing, and all that kind of stuff. Now, if we switch to the B850 model, we have a limitation here where the PCI Express 3 slot will run at 2 times speed when you install an M.2 SSD into the third slot. So that again is the limitation that we spoke about earlier. And I believe that board, the B850 board, doesn't support USB 4 either. So we'll get to that in a minute, but I'm pretty sure that's why there's no limitation with USB 4 and the Type-C ports. It's because it doesn't have any. So no such limitations on the Z890 board. So Z890 generally performs really well in terms of bandwidth sharing. It doesn't suffer a lot of it, and that is certainly the case here. You can run all 4 of its M.2 ports at full speed without any other constraints. Moving on to the B860 board, and it's mainly a space limitation here. I don't think there are any other limitations, for the simple reason that there are only 3 M.2 ports, so it kind of dips out of that having that 4th slot, but that frees up bandwidth for other things as well. So let's move on from storage. RAID, probably not going to bother covering that because I don't think many people will use it. Moving on to USB, and we can see that both the high-end boards have a lot more connectivity here, and both offer either Thunderbolt 4 or USB 4 support, so USB 4 on AMD and Thunderbolt on Intel. And the B850 board ditches USB 4, which is what we suspected earlier when we were talking about the bandwidth limitations. So just being aware of how many Type A ports you get on the rear as well. So you get plenty on the X870. Rear, we have 4 USB 2. We've got 1 USB 5 gigabit, so that's USB 3.2 speed there, and then we have another 2, so it's a reasonable number, but and it's a similar amount on the B860 board as well, but just slightly more limited compared to the higher end boards. And also worth noting that the front panel port for the Z890 board also supports fast charging. So if you want to charge your mobile phone, your smartphone at 27 watts, you'll be able to do that from the front panel connector, which is a nice feature to have as well. So networking, all boards here support 5 gigabit per second Ethernet, and just varying on the actual controllers that they use, either Realtek or Intel based, but they're fairly similar. So 5 gigabits per second across the board, and that is potentially useful because I know that internet speeds here in the UK are pushing past 1 gigabit now. So if you connect it straight up to your PC, you might even run out of bandwidth over a gigabit network cable. So the internal stuff, there's not too much to go through here. I think, we're all expecting there to be fan headers and hopefully enough of them, and RGB headers, hopefully enough of them, etc, etc. The one thing I just wanted to mention is that the boards support the EasyCon header. So that is basically a proprietary connector. You can see it here and here on that one, and EasyCon connector over here as well. And the only thing is that the last board here does not appear to support it. So the EasyCon connector is a proprietary connector that combines a fan header and an RGB header to basically save cables. So you have both of those outputs going over a single header. You obviously need a compatible option in terms of a CPU or whatever you're using, but most of the motherboards include an adapter as well. So it's just an easy way of connecting two devices, RGB and fan header, to a single header on the motherboard, just to do a bit of cable tidying, aid cable tidying basically. So other features that we have on the internal stuff, there's not too much to write home about on the X870E model. It doesn't seem like there are any thermistor headers for thermal probes and coolant probes and all that kind of stuff. Also seems like that is the case on the Z890 model as well. So, and obviously not expecting that to appear on the final model either. So if we start scrolling down, then we can have a look at the wireless and everything else. And all boards include Wi-Fi 7. So great to see that the B860 board hasn't dipped down to Wi-Fi 6 or anything like that. So just means, again, it's a little bit of added future-proofing. And that is pretty much it as far as the specifications go. They're all ATX motherboards, so there's no kind of extended ATX or anything else going on here. And yeah, that's pretty much it from the specifications. Okay, so we're going to have a hands-on session now because some features are just best explained in the flesh, and a video says 1,000 words, and I'm sure you've all had enough of looking at that table with all the red text and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to have our hands on now. So on the left we have the B860 Tomahawk, and on the right we have the Z890 Tomahawk, and we're just going to have a quick run through of some of the features that you may have missed from the table. So a big thing with current generation motherboards are tool-free features and stuff that generally makes your life a lot easier. So here we can see both boards have the PCIe easy release. So that basically allows you to just press a button and it releases your graphics card, press another button and you'll be able to lock it back in again. So super easy, both boards have that. Something that the B860 board lacks is completely tool-free M.2 heatsinks. For example, down here, the Z890 board has a quick release option down there, and just very, very easy to remove and install both heatsinks. So I'll leave that one off for a second because there's a second point I want to make. On the B860 board, we have a tool-free top heatsink, PCI Express 5 obviously in both of the top slots here. But down here we have a screw design, so not too tricky when you're coming to remove it. Just my little precision screwdriver here. Can highly recommend these. I'll put a link to it in the description down below. Super, super useful and perfectly safe to use on motherboards like this because it's got pretty low torque and it's very hard to damage anything. But definitely wouldn't recommend using a larger electronic screwdriver. So just removing all of the heat sinks for the time being. And obviously for the additional slot, we have another heatsink here on the Z890 Tomahawk. So that's worth bearing in mind as well, that even if you fill all of the slots, they will all be catered for with heatsinks. Now there is an additional cutback on the B860 board, which is that the PCI Express 5 slot doesn't have under SSD cooling, so it's not cooled on both sides. And generally, I find that PCI Express 5 SSDs do respond well to being cooled on both sides, especially the ones that have double-sided components or SSDs with components on both sides. So SSDs such as those from Crucial and Corsair and MSI, they usually have components on both sides. The one PCI Express 5 SSD that is different to that is the new Samsung 9100 Pro. That only has components on one side, so it generally fares a little bit better when the cooling isn't quite as lavish, which in this case is happening on the B860. So it's still a perfectly good motherboard, and this is more than what you'd need for cooling a PCI Express 4 SSD. But if I was going to go PCI Express 5 with my SSD, I definitely want to go for the Z890 model. Now, in terms of the VRMs, if I just look around, on the Z890 model, we have 16 phases going to the CPU, and they are all rated at 90 amps each. And some pretty chunky heat sinks as well, sort of reaching all the way over there. There's no heat pipe, but you don't generally need one unless you're going kind of crazy overclocking. But MSI's more premium motherboards in the MPG and MEG ranges usually have heat pipes as well. That's just one of their features. The B860 board, because you can't really overclock with this thing, MSI has managed to cut things back to just 12 phases for the CPU here. But I've tested this motherboard with the Core Ultra 9 285K, and it performs absolutely fine. So yeah, that's basically the key difference. But the heatsinks are pretty much the same size and same design as well. So now, if we just flip things around this way, we can see another feature that's lacking on the B860 motherboard, which is the easy con connector down here. So that thing allows you to basically plug in a proprietary connector that's included either in the box with the motherboard that splits out to two, or from a cooler such as the MSI Core Liquid series that have those connectors. So the Core Liquid A15360 that we reviewed recently here on the channel has it, and you just connect it to this connector here, and that basically gives you an RGB header and a fan header as well. And if you connect, if you have the extended option cable, then it will actually output a USB port over these things as well. So that's a pretty cool feature, and unfortunately that's also missing on the B850 model. Also missing on the B850 model is, B860, not B850. Also missing on the B860 model is the LED postcode display. I do like these. They're not so much use on Intel, but with AMD, when you're doing memory training and all that kind of stuff, the boot takes a little bit longer, and sometimes you're kind of left wondering where you are and what's happening. One of these just lets you know that everything's okay and that the board's still just doing its thing and just taking its time, really. So if we flip around and have a look at the rear panel and see the differences down here. So the Z890 board is on the top, and as we can see, we have a double the number of Thunderbolt ports, although it's still only two. And we also have USB BIOS flashback and clear CMOS buttons on both boards as well. So that's really, really good to see. Just very useful for clearing everything. We do have a few extra ports actually on the B860 model. So it does drop down to just USB 2 down here, but that does give you a couple of extra ports, or one extra port, I think. Or how many have we actually got? We've got 7 on the top board and 8 on the B860 model. So the B860 does have one extra Type A port, but the Z890 board has just one less, but all of its ports are USB 3 or above. So if you need faster USB, then the Z890 board is the one to go for. Both boards have Wi-Fi 7, and as we mentioned earlier, the one on the bottom, the B860 board, does dip down to ALC 897 on the audio codec, which may or may not dissuade you from going for it. And both boards also have another Type-C connector, which is just standard USB 3.2 10 gigabit. So that is it from the two Intel boards. We're now going to switch over to the AMDs. So here we are with the AMD boards, and we've got the B850 Tomahawk Max Wi-Fi on the left, and we have the X870E model on the right. So a few differences that are immediately obvious. We have a much thicker heatsink on the right over here, so you can see that the X870E board has much better cooling. I think it was slightly thicker on the Z890 versus B860 as well previously. But also, we can see immediately that once again, the high-end board offers underside cooling for your PCI Express 5 SSD. So you're probably going to see much better temperatures on this board with the PCI Express 5 SSD. But as I said before, the B850 board is going to be more than capable of handling PCI Express 4 SSDs. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. And again, we have a couple more tool-free options. We've got a tool-free M.2 port down here. Again, no cooling on the underside, I don't think, on any of the other ports. The other M.2 heatsinks that we've got here are all requiring a screwdriver. So I'm just going to save my wrist here and just use my little precision screwdriver to remove some of these. So we've actually got two M.2 ports under there, which is impressive. That's why there were 4 screws on that one and not 2 like we saw before. And not too many restrictions when it comes to using these motherboards, and all of their available M.2 ports. And I just want to strip everything off here so we can have a good look at what is underneath. So very similar design. We just have one extra tool-free M.2 heatsink, but both boards offering those 4 M.2 ports, and also both boards offering the quick release button here for your graphics card. So push to unlock and push to lock down there. So I just find that feature really useful. And as we saw on the Intel board, we have the LED postcode display up here. You don't get that on the B850 board, and I do find that quite useful on AMD boards for the simple reason that they can be a little bit picky when it comes to memory speeds and all that kind of stuff, and memory training. Just sometimes their boot takes a little bit longer and you're just kind of wondering where exactly you are and that kind of thing. Now, an interesting fact here is that both boards have the proprietary EasyCon connector. So I'll take a close-up look if you're just skipping to this part of the video to look at the AMD boards. So that is basically a combined fan header, RGB and USB header in one. So you can kind of connect all of those devices using an adapter cable in the box, or if your cooler comes with it, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the MSI Core Liquid A15360 makes use of this connector as well. Just cuts down on the number of headers you're going to be using to power your lighting and your fans, and just cuts down on the amount of cable tidying that you'll have to do as well. So in terms of VRMs on both these boards, they have exactly the same. I believe it's 14 phases to the CPU, and they're all rated at 80 amps as well. So if we have a quick look at the X870E model here, so we've got some pretty large heat sinks, and that sort of extends all the way over to the shroud over the I/O panel as well. No heatsink here, but no heat pipe here, but the heat sinks are pretty huge. They're quite tall as well, with these fins to increase surface area. So very similar design on both boards. So if we flip them over and have a look at the rear panel, so we have the X870 motherboard. Just going to double check that. So yeah, X870E on the top. Just wanted to make sure I get that right, so I'm not pointing in the right direction for these things. So as you can see, a very similar design. Probably the biggest difference is that the X870E board has plenty of USB 4 40 gigabit ports, an additional Type-C header down here, whereas all 3 of the Type-C ports on the B850 model are just USB Type-C 10 gigabit, so you don't get the benefit of USB 4 outputs. But both boards have clear CMOS and USB bias flashback buttons. They both have an HDMI port, And in terms of USB, we actually have more on the more expensive board this time. So we've got one 10 gigabit Type A port over here. We've got 3 USB 3, and then we have another 10 gigabit port over here. So there's 2 of those. That is actually the same on both boards, but this one just has a couple more USB 3 ports down there. So we've just got 2 more ports on the more expensive board, which may or may not benefit you, but we still have a half decent 7 Type A ports on the rear panel here. So the audio, exactly the same. It's Realtek 4080, the codec on both these boards, and both boards have Wi-Fi 7 as well. So that is pretty much it from our hands-on. So hopefully today's little roundup of MSI Tomahawk boards is going to prove useful to you when it comes to choosing the best motherboard for you. And unsurprisingly, I do have my preferences, and equally unsurprisingly, I've gone for the slightly more expensive options just because I think the extra features that they offer, as well as in the Intel motherboard case, the Z890 board offers overclocking, whereas the B860 version doesn't. And I think I would rather have a board that's capable of overclocking, especially if it only costs another 20 or 30 bucks. You're not just getting overclocking support for that extra money though, you are getting a few other features besides, which is why in the Intel corner, I would prefer to go for the Z890 option for the Tomahawk boards. When it comes to AMD, I've gone again for the slightly more expensive option, the X870E Tomahawk Wi-Fi, for the simple reason that it just adds a few of the extra features that I would probably find useful, if not now, in the near future, such as USB 4 and a few other things. So for me, the extra outlay there, even though it's a little bit more, maybe 50, 60, 70 bucks, that kind of thing, I just think it's worth spending that extra money now rather than trying to save money now then potentially in the future needing those features, which does happen a lot when we are, trying to keep hold of our motherboards for longer and longer. Especially the Socket AM5 is still going to be around for quite a while yet. So hopefully, as I mentioned, this roundup today was interesting and informative and useful for you if you're considering one of the Tomahawk boards, because they are some of my favorite boards out there. They usually punch well above their weight, and they're very rarely bad options, if at all. They've been great options in the past. So thanks to MSI for helping out with today's video again. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Liking and commenting just helps punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed. And don't forget to turn on notifications if you do subscribe. And all of the hardware, all of the motherboards and that kind of stuff that we've featured in today's video can be found in the description down below. So there's a whole load of buy links down there that will take you straight through to being able to buy these products, which I can highly recommend. And there's a load of other links that you might be interested in down there as well, including a link to my Amazon shop, where there's a whole bunch of stuff that I've tried and tested here on the channel. So that's about it for me today. I'll be back very, very soon. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you later.